Would you believe me if I told you that in 1945, while Britain was celebrating the end of the Second World War, a man was found murdered in a quiet English village in a way so brutal, so strange, that detectives genuinely considered witchcraft as a motive? Not gang violence, not robbery, not revenge. Witchcraft. An old farm labourer was discovered pinned to the ground with his own pitchfork. A slash had been carved across his throat. A strange symbol was cut into his chest. And surrounding the body were whispers that this wasn't a murder at all, but a sacrifice. The deeper you go into this case, the worse it gets. Because this wasn't some medieval story dug out of a dusty history book. This happened in modern Britain. Police investigated it, newspapers reported it, and to this day, nobody has ever been charged. Some people believe that the killer died decades ago. Others believe the murder was connected to black magic groups operating in the English countryside. And one very famous occult researcher became convinced that the death of this old man was linked to another mystery you may have heard of. A woman found stuffed inside of a tree? Bella in the witch elm? That's right. Apparently we've got ritual murder cinematic universe lore. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is William and welcome to the Baker Street Bureau. If true crime, paranormal, and the outright unexplainable are your thing, you're in the right place. Now, I've set myself a goal of hitting 100 subscribers before the end of the year, so if you want to join me on that journey and support me, that's the best way you can. Now, the aspiring YouTuber waffle is out of the way. Let's travel to the quiet countryside of Warwickshire for what many people still call the last ritual killing in Britain. Our story begins in the tiny village of Lower Quinton, a peaceful little place sitting on the edge of the Cotswolds in Warwickshire. The kind of village where people wave at each other in the street, the kind of village where everyone knows everything. The kind of place where if someone sneezes in the morning, the post office hears about it before lunch. In 1945, Lower Quinton was even quieter. Britain had just emerged from the Second World War. The country was exhausted. Cities had been bombed. Food was rationed. Entire generations had been shaped by loss. But rural England carried on much the way as it always had. Fields needed tending, animals needed feeding, and old farming traditions still hung over the countryside like fog. Because whilst London and Manchester were embracing modern life, some rural villages still clung tightly onto ancient beliefs. Folk magic, superstitions, stories about curses, bad harvests, witches, the evil eye. To outsiders, it sounds ridiculous. But if you grew up in an isolated countryside community, strange beliefs have a way of surviving, especially when they've been passed down for generations. And in Lower Quinton, there was one man who people whispered about the most: Charles Walton. Charles Walton was born in 1870. By the time of his death, he was 74 years old. A farm labourer who had spent practically his entire life working the land around Warwickshire. People described him as quiet, reserved, a little bit odd, but harmless. He lived alone in a small cottage called Meadow Cottage, situated not too far from the village. He'd never married, he'd rarely travelled, and according to locals, he seemed perfectly content keeping to himself. Now, if you ask the people in the village what they thought of Charles, they'd tell you that he was just an old countryman. But if you dug a little deeper, the stories started. Some villagers believed that Charles had strange abilities. Others claimed he could charm animals. Some insisted that he had the power to curse crops. One story claimed that years earlier, a local farmer's cattle mysteriously died after an argument with Walton. Another suggested that he had once been seen performing strange rituals in the fields. Whether any of this was true is impossible to know, but one thing becomes very clear when researching this case. People feared him. Not openly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, deeply British way where people lower their voice in a pub and say, "He's not quite right, him." And in old English villages, reputations like that stick. On the 14th of February 1945, Charles Walton woke up and went to work like every other day. It was Valentine's Day, which feels weirdly ironic considering what was about to happen. Walton had been employed by a farmer named Alfred Potter. That morning, he was tasked with trimming hedges in a field called Meon Hill. Now, Meon Hill itself deserves a mention because this place had already had a dark reputation long before Walton died. Towering over the surrounding countryside, Meon Hill was linked to old folklore and local ghost stories. Some people believed it was cursed. Others believed witches gathered there. And during the Civil War, the area had apparently seen executions and violence. Basically, if you were location scouting for a horror film, this place would be shortlisted immediately. Throughout the day, locals saw Charles working alone in the field. Nothing appeared unusual. Then at around 6 p.m., Alfred Potter became concerned. Charles hadn't returned. So Potter walked out to the field to look for him. What he discovered would become one of the most infamous murder scenes in British history. Charles Walton was dead. His body lay sprawled on the ground. His own pitchfork had been driven through his neck and into the earth, pinning him to the ground. He'd been beaten in the head. His throat had been slashed so violently that some reports claim he was nearly decapitated. Now, according to certain accounts, a strange cross-shaped cut had been carved into his chest. Now, immediately, detectives realized that this wasn't some robbery gone wrong. Nothing had been stolen. His watch remained on his wrist, money still in his pockets. This was personal. It was violent. It was overkill. The kind of killing driven by rage. Or fear? Warwickshire police launched a major investigation, and from the very beginning, the case was chaos. The murder scene itself was deeply unusual. Officers described the brutality as excessive. Experienced detectives struggled to understand why someone would kill a frail 74-year-old man with such aggression. What made things worse was the local gossip. Almost immediately, whispers spread throughout Lower Quinton. It was witchcraft. Now, imagine being a detective in 1945. You're trying to solve a murder. The country is just coming out of World War II, and half the village keeps telling you the victim was killed by witches. It's less than ideal. But here's where things get genuinely strange. One of the detectives assigned to the case was Superintendent Robert Fabian, a highly respected Scotland Yard investigator. A man known for being logical, experienced, and methodical. Fabian wasn't some eccentric paranormal enthusiast. He was a serious detective. Yet, even he admitted later that the atmosphere surrounding the case deeply unsettled him. Fabian arrived in Lower Quinton expecting to solve a straightforward rural murder. Instead, he found an entire village paralyzed by fear and superstition. People refused to talk. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Rumors spread faster than facts, and everywhere he went, the same stories followed him. Charles Walton was a witch, or he'd been killed by witches, or both. Now, we need to pause for a second, because this is where the case takes a hard left turn into absolute madness. There is an old piece of English folklore involving witches and blood sacrifice tied to the farming communities. Some traditions claimed that killing a witch could break curses affecting crops or livestock. One method supposedly involved pinning a victim to the ground with a pitchfork. That detail grabbed people's attention immediately, because Charles Walton had been pinned to the ground with a pitchfork. Then there was the throat cutting, the symbol on his chest, the isolated field, the timing during winter. To people already steeped in folklore, this didn't look random, it looked ceremonial. Fabian later wrote that local villagers genuinely believed that Walton had supernatural powers. Some even claimed crops failed whenever he walked near certain fields. Now, personally, I think humans are very good at connecting random dots together after a tragedy. If something horrifying happens, our brains desperately want meaning. And in isolated villages where folklore survives, superstition becomes a very easy explanation. But there's one problem. If this wasn't ritualistic, why kill him like that? Why not simply stab him? Why the excessive violence? Why pin him to the earth? The brutality feels symbolic. And that's what's kept this case alive for decades. As investigators dug deeper into Walton's life, the stories became stranger. Some of the villagers claimed that Walton could supposedly bewitch animals. Others said he carried strange objects in his pockets. One woman claimed that he'd once threatened someone and their livestock later died. Again, there's absolutely no evidence that Charles Walton was involved in witchcraft, but what matters isn't whether it was true, it was whether people believed it. And enough people clearly did. One particularly strange story involved a local woman accusing Walton of placing a curse on her. Another claimed that he'd been seen driving pegs into the ground in strange patterns. Now, realistically, the man was probably just an eccentric old farmer doing eccentric old farmer things. But once fear takes hold of a community, every odd behavior suddenly becomes sinister. And remember, this is wartime Britain. People were already anxious, already traumatized, already primed to believe strange things. Fabian himself became increasingly disturbed by the sheer number of villagers who spoke about Walton in fearful tones. Not hated, fear. Like they genuinely believed something dark surrounded him. Despite all the occult rumors, the police still had to investigate real suspects. And they did have quite a few. One local man reportedly had a violent temper and knew Walton. Another had argued with him previously. Several farm workers in the area were also questioned, but there was never enough evidence. No murder weapon before the pitchfork already at the scene. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no confession. Remember, forensic science in 1945 was nowhere near where it was today. There's no CCTV, no DNA, no mobile phone records. There was no one filming things on TikTok every 10 seconds and dancing in the streets. If someone committed a murder in a quiet field and kept their mouth shut, solving it became incredibly difficult. Especially when the entire village seemed terrified of speaking openly. Fabian later admitted that he believed villagers were withholding information, but whether that was due to fear of a killer or fear of being associated with witchcraft stories, nobody knows. One thing that keeps coming up when reading accounts from investigators is the atmosphere. People described the case almost like a horror film. Fog-covered fields, ancient hills, suspicious villagers, whispers about curses. And look, I know that sounds dramatic, but when enough people collectively believe that something is wrong, it changes the feeling of a place. Fabian reportedly became so unsettled by the investigation that he eventually stepped away from it entirely. That's important, because this was not a man known for superstition. Yet even he later admitted there was something deeply uncomfortable about Lower Quinton. Now, do I think that there were covens of murderous witches sacrificing old men in fields? Probably not. But do I think fear and folklore had completely infected this investigation from day one? And once that happens, people stop behaving rationally. Witnesses become unreliable, rumors become facts, every coincidence suddenly feels meaningful. And the Charles Walton case is basically the perfect sum of all of that. Now, remember earlier when I mentioned Bella and the Witch Elm? I know, we're going back there. I've already made a video about Bella and the Witch Elm, and within that I mentioned this, so now we're completing the circle. Go watch it if you hadn't. It's a banger. A famous anthropologist and occult researcher named Margaret Murray became fascinated by Walton's murder. Murray strongly believed that the killing was ritualistic. She linked it directly to ancient pagan practices and witchcraft traditions. But she didn't stop there. Murray also became involved in theories surrounding the mysterious death discovered inside the tree in Hagley Woods, Bella and the Witch Elm. According to Murray, both deaths were connected through occult activity. She theorized that Bella's missing hand related to something called a Hand of Glory, an old magical object supposedly used by thieves and occult practitioners. Then she pointed to Walton's pitchfork killing. Suddenly, people began wondering, were these isolated crimes? Or evidence of secret occult practices operating in rural England? Now, personally, I think Margaret Murray saw witchcraft absolutely everywhere. She became notorious for linking unrelated events to pagan rituals, but the media loved it. Because, let's be honest, a murdered farmer during an occult sacrifice is a much more compelling headline than old man killed in unresolved local dispute. Once the newspapers grabbed hold of the ritual killing angle, the story exploded. Newspapers across Britain sensationalized the murder. Articles described Walton as everything from a harmless old labourer to a feared village wizard. Headlines leaned heavily towards the occult angle because by 1945, the British public had an enormous appetite for strange stories, especially after the war. People were exhausted by years of death and destruction, and weird mysteries captured the public imagination. The press turned Lower Quinton into a national curiosity. Tourists even travelled to the village, hoping to get a glimpse of the infamous Meon Hill, which I always find really bizarre, because British people absolutely love turning real tragedy into day trips. Fancy a picnic near the ritual murder field? It's just weird British behaviour. But the publicity also made the investigation harder, because every crank in the country suddenly had their theories. Psychics contacted the police, occult enthusiasts inserted themselves into the story. People claimed that Walton's spirit was haunting the fields. The investigation slowly drowned beneath folklore. So, who actually killed Charles Walton? Well, there are several major theories. The simplest explanation is that Walton was murdered by someone he knew. Perhaps an argument escalated, perhaps old grudges existed within the village, perhaps someone with violent tendencies attacked him. The excessive violence could suggest personal hatred, and the pitchfork may simply have just been the nearest weapon available. This theory makes the most logical sense, but it still doesn't explain the theatrical nature of the crime scene. Some researchers believe that the killer genuinely believed that Walton was a witch. Remember, these beliefs still existed in isolated rural communities. If someone truly believed that Walton cursed the crops or the livestock, it's possible that they killed him in a way that they thought was a proactive act. Which sounds insane to modern ears, but fear makes people do unbelievable things. And history is full of witchcraft-related killings, even surprisingly recent ones. Now, the third theory is the one that gets all the attention. The idea that Walton was deliberately killed during some sort of ritual. Supporters point to the pitchfork, the throat wound, the symbol on his chest, the isolated location, and the folklore surrounding Meon Hill. But there is very little actual evidence supporting the organized occult involvement. mostly atmosphere, rumor, and interpretation. It's still really creepy though. Now, the fourth theory is probably the most likely. A killer exploited the confusion and superstition surrounding the case. I mean, imagine committing a brutal murder in a village already obsessed with folklore. The second people start shouting witchcraft, occult, the investigation becomes polluted. It's actually the perfect smokescreen. And if that's true, whoever killed Charles Walton was smarter than people realize. Superintendent Fabian eventually left the investigation, unconvinced by the occult explanations, but he also never solved the case. Years later, he spoke publicly about strange atmosphere surrounding Lower Quinton. He admitted the village deeply unsettled him. One account even claims that Fabian believed he identified the likely killer, but lacked enough evidence to charge them. According to rumors, the suspect later died in an asylum, but again, nothing was ever proven. And this is where the Charles Walton case becomes genuinely frustrating. Because depending on which source you read, the story changes. Some accounts exaggerate the ritual elements, others dismiss them entirely. Some claim that the symbols carved into Walton's chest, and others say that there weren't any. It's a case built on blurred lines, and after 80 years, separating the fact from the folklore has become almost impossible. But there's a reason why people still talk about Charles Walton. Because this case sits right on the line between true crime and folklore. Most murder mysteries eventually become clinical, cold, evidence-based. But this one still feels haunted. An old man murdered beneath an ancient hill. A terrified village whispers about curses. A detective disturbed by the atmosphere, and no answers. It taps into something deeply British. That feeling that beneath the modern roads and villages, something ancient still lingers. Old beliefs, old fears, old superstitions. Britain is a very strange country when you really peel back the layers. It's one of the reasons why we love it. Because we've built modern life directly on top of thousands of years of folklore. Every village has ghost stories, every woodland has rumors, every old hill apparently has a demon living on it. And the Charles Walton case feels like all of that collided violently with reality. Today, most historians believe the murder was likely carried out by a real human with a very real and ordinary motive. Maybe anger, paranoia, revenge. The occult explanations probably grew because the case itself was so visually disturbing. And to be fair, if you discovered an elderly man pinned to the ground with a pitchfork on a lonely hillside in rural England, your brain probably wouldn't leap immediately to normal murder. But even modern researchers admit that the case is incredibly unusual. The violence was excessive, the setting was eerie, and the surrounding folklore genuinely influenced both public perception and the investigation itself. Which makes this one of the rare cases where myth actively shaped reality. There's one thing that I keep coming back to with this case. Fear. Not fear of the victim, fear from the village. Because people don't collectively create stories like this out of nowhere. Something about Charles Walton clearly unsettled people long before he died. Maybe he was eccentric, maybe he enjoyed playing into the rumors. Maybe villagers simply projected their fears onto an isolated old man. But when fear festers long enough in small communities, it changes people. And I genuinely wonder whether someone eventually convinced themselves that killing Walton was justified. Not murder, protection. And that is far more terrifying. Because if someone kills you out of rage, at least they know that they are committing evil. If someone kills you believing that they're doing the right thing, that's a completely different level of horror. So, was Charles Walton truly the last ritual killing in Britain? Honestly, probably not. There have been plenty of cases since involving alleged occult motives, but what makes Walton's death different is how deeply it has embedded itself into British folklore. The image alone is unforgettable. Old man, lonely field, pitchfork through the neck, carvings. It feels less like a crime scene and more like something dragged from medieval England. Maybe that's why this case refuses to die. Because it reminds us that modern Britain isn't as modern as we like to pretend. Beneath the motorways and housing estates, old fears survive. People still believe strange things, still fear curses, still whisper about places they won't walk after dark. And somewhere in the countryside of Warwickshire, Meon Hill still stands watching over the fields where Charles Walton took his final breath. A murder unsolved, a village forever marked, and a question that has lingered for over 80 years. Who killed Charles Walton and why? Ladies and gentlemen, my name is William and this is the Baker Street Bureau. If you're into true crime, paranormal, and the outright unexplainable, you're in the right place. I really hope you've enjoyed today's video. This is one of the most fascinating stories that I have ever read, that I have ever written, and that I have ever had the chance of delivering. So I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. Obviously, it is wild and it's tragic. A man died after all, but these things are weird, aren't they? Kind of makes me want to get in the car and take a trip to Meon Hill and just have a little look, but I am also British, therefore I am immediately scared of that place. So I think I will be avoiding it like the plague. So I will leave you to the rest of your day. And as always, in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.